I'm Jeff Mays of the New York Times, sitting in for Sam Roberts. Welcome to the New York Times Close Up. This week, we are doing a deep dive on the Mamdani agenda. I'd like to welcome two of my colleagues to discuss Mayor Mamdani's budget and the fight to raise taxes on the wealthy. Emma Fitzsimmons is a public policy correspondent after 5 years as City Hall bureau chief. She's been covering Mamdani's push on childcare, taxing the wealthy, and the Affording New York series, including a recent piece that struck a nerve online about an Upper West Side family living on $500,000 a year. Benjamin Oreskes covers our state politics and the budget fights linking City Hall in Albany. He and I, along with our colleague Sally Goldenberg, just reported on Mamdani's retreat from his property tax hike proposal, even as the city faces a $5.4 billion budget gap. Ben has also been tracking the push in Albany to raise taxes on the rich. Welcome to you both.
Let me just start by saying I gladly will volunteer to be featured in your Affording New York column if I made $500,000. But
yeah, I think we should. That was my idea. Let's have a New York Times reporter profiled in that, and I volunteered you.
But I need a raise first before we do.
So yeah, Emma, your piece about this couple on the Upper West Side that made $500,000, it did cause a bit of a stir. I'm wondering, is $500,000 in New York City, does that make you wealthy?
Well, I think that's what was so interesting about this couple. They identify as middle class, even though they make $500,000 a year, because a lot of their neighbors make even more money. But with this series, we're doing a different family every week, and we wanted to really have a diversity of backgrounds. And so when I went to visit this family, they said, look, we're spending $4,200 a month on childcare, and that's a lot of money over the course of a year, and they're trying to save up to buy an apartment. And so I think the reaction, though, like some people were nitpicking about their laundry service. They get their laundry folded and delivered, right? I do my laundry in the basement, you know. But I think we really wanted to hear about how people from all different backgrounds like afford living in the city, which is so, so expensive.
Yeah, and I think a couple of points that raised some ire online were they saved $10,000 a month, and secondly, they were looking forward to the free pre-K program. Why do you think that struck such a nerve with readers?
Yeah, some people were mad that they would qualify for free preschool when their kid turns 4, but that's how it's been for almost a decade now. It's a universal program, and the people who instituted it and Mamdani really feel like it has to be available to everyone, to poor families, to rich families, to have buy-in from everyone. But I think the idea of saving $10,000 a month is smart, right, financially. And when they invited me into their bedroom, and their bed is right next to their crib for their almost 2-year-old who wakes them up at 5 a.m. So they said, we really want a bigger apartment. So we're really motivated to save. But I think, it's interesting, too, in the context of Mamdani's tax increases on the rich, because he wants to raise taxes for people who make over $1 million. They're sort of trying to decide where is the line where it's appropriate to raise taxes. And this family might say, look, we're just getting by. We really don't want our taxes raised.
Yeah, certainly this couple might be, I don't know if they would be hit with the wealth tax I think it starts at $1 million or more. But we wrote recently about Mamdani threatening to raise property taxes if the state did not tax the wealthy. I'm wondering that sort of position for him, did that go well?
Well, it's probably worth stepping back for a second just for the viewers to understand that the city is a creation of the state. To get buy-in on most taxes, they need state legislation and the approval of the governor. The state's budget is due on April 1st, though they always run late, and the city's budget is due later. So they are in this dance, a game of chicken, if you will, about planning their financial outlook for the next couple of years. And in the case of Mamdani, he goes out there last month in February and says, if we don't get this from the state, if we don't get these taxes on the wealthy and on large corporations, we are going to do this. Raise property taxes with the assent of the city council. It didn't go well. It angered the governor, to start, who felt like she was, being cornered by someone she's trying to negotiate with. And it angered a lot of politicians who represent homeowners, particularly black politicians, where we see black homeownership as a way to create wealth. And both of these constituencies that the mayor really needs were saying to him, you're punishing middle class and lower class people. And he would say, I don't want to do this. This is a path of last resort. But they felt like putting this out into the ether put undue pressure on them and was never realistic. It was a false threat.
I wonder, did they think about this beforehand? Did they talk to the governor? Did they talk to the state legislators that represent some of the black homeowners? Or was this just an option they threw out?
Well, our reporting showed that the Mamdani administration was sort of surprised by the level of blowback. So it suggests that they hadn't fully thought this through. Obviously, the governor and the mayor have kind of created a sort of surprising buddy comedy throughout the election and now into his first year in office, where they've partnered to bring billions of dollars towards universal childcare to expand it. And you know, she is a Buffalo mom. He is a 30-something-year-old dude from the Upper West Side and now from Astoria. It was a surprising alliance, and this was the first sort of fissure that we have seen between them. And I think that people have acknowledged that it was sort of a misstep.
This couple you profiled, Emma, you know, they make $500,000 a year. How do you think they would respond if there was a wealth tax imposed on people in New York City?
I think there's a political consensus that it needs to be at an income of $1 million or more, or even state lawmakers are looking at $5 million or more. It might be more palatable. And you know, Bernie Sanders is coming to town to rally for taxing the rich. Mamdani isn't going to be there. I thought that was really interesting that he's not putting the full heft of his political support behind this push. But I think, you know, the governor's running for re-election, and after she wins another term, maybe that's the time when Mamdani's really going to put pressure on her to raise taxes.
And I would just note one thing. As her re-election sort of begins, she's running against a Republican from Long Island. An income tax is something that the state would need to improve. She has said, over my dead body. So I think that that is an area where we will not see her move. Where we might see her move is on a corporate increase in the corporate business tax, an increase on surcharges on property sales. So, you know, there's sort of the city and the state are in this dance right now. The legislators are negotiating right now to figure out what is the least bad thing they could do. And it may be nothing. They may not do anything and just give the city more aid to fill its deficit.
But there appears to be daylight between the governor and the state legislature, right? They've suggested $5 million, as Emma suggested.
Yeah, so both the State Assembly and the State Senate put out what is called a one-house budget. It's a wish list. It's a political document meant to please their constituents. So if you're a DSA member from Brooklyn or you're a conservative member from Rockland County, you can say to your voters, I got this in there. It doesn't really affect what the final document it is. I mean, in some sense, where there is unanimity about things, it will help in negotiations. But so to the point about, an income tax, that is in there. I don't expect that to be in the final budget. But there is definitely daylight. Both the Senate and the Assembly have for years wanted to raise taxes on the wealthy. The governor, who has very close relationships with large business executives, has said she worries about asset flight. She worries rich millionaires and billionaires will move to Florida or businesses will relocate. This is a sort of roiling debate. It's kind of hard to see how much of this is about politics and how much is about policy.
Mayor Mamdani wants to tax the wealthy to sort of pay for some of his proposals, universal childcare. How do you think that's going among the wealthy? Is there like a divide between people who make above $1 million and are in favor of this or not in favor of this? How does that play?
Yeah, I spoke with a group called the Patriotic Millionaires for a story that also got a lot of attention online. They said, please do tax me more. I believe in his agenda. Please raise my taxes. And just as many people in the comments said, no, please don't raise my taxes. But I think there is, one of the women I talked to, she's from a very wealthy family and she works in philanthropy. And she said, my kid is in 3K, in free 3K. And I can afford a private school, but I believe in the public system. We use the parks, we use the libraries. Like, I want these public programs funded, so find a way to tax me more. But I think there's a real, I think Hochul is worried and others are worried there's a real tipping point where if taxes get too high, people will leave the state. And we're seeing what's happening in California and Washington state, where some prominent wealthy people are saying they're going to move away. So I think there is a concern about that. But Mamdani ran on this, right? And I don't think he's going to just drop it. I think he's going to pick it up in earnest after the governor's re-election.
How big of a factor is the wealthy moving away on the governor being dead set against raising taxes on the wealthy?
It's a huge part of her worldview and thinking. Much of her life story is out of upstate New York. She went to Syracuse for college. She watched businesses leave the state, and she has been very proud of the fact that she has been able to bring new enterprise to places like Buffalo, to places like Syracuse, Micron, these advanced manufacturing things. And so she is talking to executives from these companies. She's very sensitive to their views. And she has a deep feeling that she wants to see this state. She proudly is a capitalist in the way that our mayor might not say he is. And that definitely drives how she is thinking about this process.
These millionaires you spoke to, Emma, Mayor Mamdani has said, if you make above $1 million, the tax rate increase he's proposing will only cost you $20,000. So what's different between these millionaires you spoke to and other millionaires, even people who may have more money than some of these folks, about paying like what seems to be an incremental increase if you make above a certain amount of money?
Yeah, I think these millionaires are more progressive, more civic-minded. I think that they have backed Democratic candidates in the past and sort of believe in this worldview. But they do say, look, it's $20,000 a year. I asked them about would you not be able to afford your second home? Would you not be able to afford private school? And one example they gave was if someone made just $1 million and they had 3 kids in private school and a house in the Hamptons, maybe it'd be tough on them. And then readers, of course, said, well, boo-hoo. I don't feel sorry for the people with the second home in the Hamptons. But there is, even one of the millionaires I spoke with, this was left out of this story, but he said, you really need to make like inequality in New York City not so severe, or else there's going to be an uprising. He said, we don't want the French Revolution, which made me laugh because, he's saying we need to throw some crumbs to people who are struggling, or, they're going to kick us out of office. Or I think there is this real sense that inequality in New York City has reached a breaking point.
Right. And in terms of the property tax situation, Ben, where are we at with that? Because the issue, especially we delved into in our article, Black homeowners, as you said, who see this homes as a form of wealth, one of the few forms of wealth that they have. I'm wondering, where is Mamdani's response to that? Has he responded particularly to Black homeowners? And is he still even considering the idea of a property tax increase?
Yeah, so since our article came out, he insists that this is a path of last resort. But we spoke to like almost a dozen lawmakers, both from the state legislature and the city council, who basically came away from meeting with him in small groups privately behind closed doors with the impression that he really doesn't want to do this and doesn't intend to do this. And again, it felt like a false threat. And for these, Black legislators, Latino legislators, they felt like many of them felt like they're being used sort of as a bargaining chip. And so where this stands now is the state is sort of seeking from the city more cuts, essentially, more savings. And we've heard from the mayor and his team in recent days identifying things they plan to save. Sally Goldenberg and I reported recently that they have, behind closed doors again, privately found another $1 billion or so in savings. The budget deficit is about $5.4 billion. That would bring it down more to 4. Again, I think the governor and her team and the state legislative leaders want to see a more serious, credible effort at finding savings from the mayor, who is reluctant to cut things. He ran on expanding the social safety net. He ran on making more things available to people, and it's very hard to do that when you have a deficit like he has.
Yeah, let me ask you, both of you, is taxing the wealthy the only way to raise revenue? Like, that feels like that is a progressive goal and has been since, Bill de Blasio. Obviously, Bernie Sanders talks about that nationally. Are there other ways to sort of bring in revenue? What about business creation? What about, you talked about savings a little bit. Like, is taxing the wealthy the only way? No,
I mean, there's lots of other ways to raise revenue, but I think Mamdani believes in it as a revenue raiser, but also ideologically that it's fair. But I just wanted to add, I think it is politically perilous if Mamdani makes deep cuts as part of these budget discussions. I covered Eric Adams cutting the libraries, and I think that was sort of the beginning of the end for him. And I think Mamdani ran on more funding for the libraries and parks, and now he's talking about cutting those programs. And I'm not sure how he explains that to voters who really care about those issues.
I would just add that we know the Citizens Budget Commission has shown in reports that the city has one of the highest tax burdens in the country. Right. And I think for a lot of voters, they look at how much they are already paying, how their property taxes may not have gone up in 20 years, but they're constantly being reassessed and the value of their homes is going up. So they're paying a lot. And so when you look at the offerings out there, they see the education department's budget going up every year. They see the amount of money that is being poured into government and saying, what are we getting for that? And so Mamdani did run on this expansion of the safety net and funding of programs, as Emma said. He also ran on making things work better. And so I think a lot of voters want to see that. And similarly, the city has any number of different tax cuts, different programs that have just expanded without really any deep look at them. I think the governor would say that she wants him to kind of dig into that and show a real good faith effort of trying to contain those costs before she talks about raising taxes on businesses, raising taxes on individuals.
And how long is this going to take? The budget is due.
It's a great question. It's statutorily it is due April 1st. The governor has shown, her predecessor, Andrew Cuomo, really believed in the budget being due by then. He thought it was like a political cudgel that should be followed. She is less into that. So last year, the budget stretched well into April. I think the year before it went into May. So I would expect the budget to be late. And they are negotiating over any number of different things that have very little to do with New York City's budgetary picture. They're fighting over reforms to auto insurance, climate legislation. All of these things get tied to one another because they get put in the budget. It's a way for the governor to extract leverage. And so, call me in 2 weeks, call me in 3 weeks, we'll see where we're at. And then, of course, the city's budget is due in July.
Right. Emma, Mayor Mamdani had some very bold proposals when he was running for office. Universal childcare, fast and free buses, promised to freeze the rent. I'm wondering, have you seen progress on those initiatives? And what is at stake if he isn't able to accomplish some of those goals?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think he cares the most about universal childcare, and they're taking some concrete steps. This September, we'll have the first 2K seats, 2,000 seats for 2-year-olds. They're expanding 3K to reach the neighborhoods that don't have enough seats, and those are meaningful. That's meaningful progress on this campaign pledge, but to make it truly universal for every child under 5 is going to cost a lot of money. And I don't know if he can do that without raising taxes on the rich in future years. And so he's really set high expectations. He's bringing little kids to his news conferences. He's really promised this. I wrote a story about a baby boom that could be coming. If people know this is guaranteed, they're saying, hey, let's have a second kid or let's have a first. We can afford it now. So if he doesn't follow through on that promise, it's really going to disappoint his voters. And then on the rent freeze, I think he's making progress on moving forward with that. The Rent Guidelines Board is going to be meeting and starting to discuss freezing the rent. And then fast and free buses is, of course, maybe farther off into the distance. My 8-year-old takes the bus to school every morning, the MTA bus, and he said, why aren't buses free yet, Mom? And, we're approaching 100 days, so he has not hit that campaign pledge yet.
Are people really monitoring the city and state budget to decide family planning decisions?
Okay, so when an editor pitches you an idea and you're like, I'm not sure if that's a story, but I'll try to find out. That's what happened in this case. And then I ended up finding lots of families. One woman, she posted on Mamdani's video when he announced universal childcare and said, tagged her husband and said, are we ready for a second now? And I followed up with them. And I think that right now it is so expensive to live in New York City. People really are waiting to have children or maybe deciding not to. And the idea of having free universal childcare could prompt them to take a step forward.
I would just add one thing to that we have seen a level of engagement with the mayor. I mean, it comes from the enthusiasm about his election where he is doing things that maybe we've seen other mayors do, talking about cuts in certain ways or filling potholes. And you see this discourse online and in talking to voters of people being like, he is changing the paradigm, he is changing the game. And that for us who have covered this for a long time, we are sort of like, this is packaging, this is marketing. But it's kind of encouraging to see this level of engagement with government, even if it's about procreation and family planning.
Yeah, he's been out on social media. He did a video on on budget the other day and property taxes, right? So he's really reaching out to the public. I'm wondering, in the long term, Mamdani's relationship with Governor Hochul, a lot of his agenda appears to be tied up in the state. So with this property tax proposal he made, I'm wondering, did he damage that relationship? And, is it reparable at all?
It's a really good question because I think a little bit of a history lesson is worth here. You covered this and you were around too. The beginning of the end for the relationship between Bill de Blasio and Andrew Cuomo came during the first legislative session that de Blasio was in office, where he too wanted tax increases to fund expansions of childcare. And Andrew Cuomo said, I'll just give you the money to do it. And Bill de Blasio stood on ceremony and wanted the tax increase. And these were two headstrong people, and they fought for a decade as a result of, or not a decade. And I think Mamdani learned a lot of lessons from that. He really realized that you need to have a good relationship with the governor, and you need to be able to work with her and defer to her in certain ways. And I think similarly, the governor who takes over from Andrew Cuomo when he resigns in scandal wanted to have a better relationship with the city. He worked very closely with Eric Adams, despite his foibles, and she has made it very clear that she will work very closely with him because she wants the city to succeed. This was a major fight that they had, Mamdani and the mayor. I've heard from people that it's over, they've moved on, but it's something to watch, and it will be a very good question to check back on in a couple months.
Do that. Bill de Blasio, you mentioned Bill de Blasio, and his whole thing was income inequality. And that was, a tale of two cities. And I'm wondering, is what Mamdani is doing now, is that a modern repackaging of the inequality debate?
It really is the same debate that we've been having for years. Ever since Bloomberg left office, there was this sense that New York City was becoming a playland for the rich. And so Mamdani called it something different, right? He said we're dealing with an affordability crisis. But it's really, when you look at the statistics, our colleague just wrote a story about the poverty rate and inequality rising in New York City. It really is still a tale of two cities. And Mamdani's trying to address that, but it's not something that a mayor necessarily really can control. He's trying to build housing. But I wanted to add, I do think watching the de Blasio and Cuomo fiasco, it does seem like there is some personal affinity between Hochul and Mamdani. He's the same age as her son. She seems to genuinely like him, but at the same time, she is pragmatic, and he better not mess with her reelection.
I 100% agree with you, and I think that their dynamic, to your point, I heard this great anecdote that we had in a story about how Hochul gave Mamdani a piece of advice to make sure he takes his recently married wife out for dinner and go to movies and dates. And the mayor is taken to either texting the governor after they go out on one or before. Just, again, Mamdani is very good at the human part of politics. He really fosters connection with people. And the governor responds well to that. She is someone who has not, been popular. And her backing of him during the fall was huge, and her popularity has risen. I think it's not just because of her backing of Mamdani, but she is in a very strong position, and I do think her alignment with the mayor is part of that.
That relationship seems to have paid dividends for Mamdani, right? The governor has already given the city, how much? Is it $2 billion, $3 billion?
Between the 1.7 or so for childcare, for 2 years of childcare that will pay for this expansion of 3K and starting of 2K, and then another 1.5 billion just in state aid, for certain specific programs. That's $3 billion, and I think that colors this moment right now where she is saying, I have been extremely generous, and I want to see a serious financial planning from you guys before I commit to more money or commit to raising taxes.
And you wrote a story recently about those cuts. Are those cuts real? He announced the other day that the budget is now down to $5.4 billion. He originally projected $12.6 billion. Are those real cuts, and are there more cuts that need to be made?
Yeah, I think there's a belief that more cuts do need to be made. I mean, again, this is a negotiation. His final budget isn't due for several months, so they're in this dance. And so the cuts kind of ranged in scale and size. The Taxing Limousine Commission will no longer use Slack. $20,000, they're not going to have that. Others were bigger, obviously auditing how healthcare, dependence on healthcare, that's $100 million in savings. But that was $1.7 billion in savings. And that's a $5.4 billion deficit. So again, that delta, that difference between those numbers needs to shrink. There's two ways to do that: cutting, raising taxes.
Right.
And I think that there's a real belief out of Albany and a real belief, a real sense of denial maybe out of the mayor's office that they need to do more cutting.
You've been monitoring, the public policy perspective. The money that Mamdani got from Hochul, does that mean that 2K is starting immediately? Is the program up and running, or when will it be up and running?
So starting in September, there'll be 2,000 seats in 4 neighborhoods, including in my neighborhood, Washington Heights and Inwood and Upper Manhattan. And they pick these neighborhoods because they're places where there are a lot of working class families that need childcare. But they're starting small, 2,000 seats. The next year there will be 10,000 more seats. But I think it's meaningful progress to extend it to 2-year-olds, and it's a different age group, right? These are little toddlers who are napping and require a lot more care than someone who's almost in kindergarten. But I think he's been visiting preschools and like really raising awareness about this, and I think they want it to be sustainable, basically. They're not going to release 40,000 new seats tomorrow, but they want to make meaningful progress. And it is popular with voters.
Has he fixed the problems with 3K? There were lots of complaints under Mayor Adams about seats not being available, seats being far away. Have they addressed that before they've started to move on to 2K?
So the first thing he did was start this sort of marketing campaign urging families to apply for 3K by the deadline, which was about a month ago. We haven't yet determined how many people applied and how many are going to enroll, but based on the application numbers, they are expanding 1,000 seats to neighborhoods like some wealthy neighborhoods. On the Upper West Side, they don't have enough 3K seats. They are expanding seats in neighborhoods that don't have them. He says, I don't want you to live in Upper West Side and get a seat in Staten Island. And I face this. My son was in 3K, and we listed 6 schools on our application. We got our second choice, and our neighborhood has some good options for 3K. But in other neighborhoods, they really didn't have a good public option, so they would stay in private school. But I think it's going to take time to fix what happened under Eric Adams with 3K. He really wasn't committed to it, and he really removed funding.
Yeah, so I want you guys to put on your hats, your prognostication hats, and tell me, a year from now, what does Mayor Mamdani need to have done to sort of be seen as accomplishing some of those goals? And maybe you tell me, what do you predict about the future of Hochul and Mamdani's relationship?
A year from now, it would be helpful for him to have the rent freeze enacted. It would be helpful for those seats to be up and running for 2K and expanding to 10,000 more. And I think those are achievable goals while he is confronting all of this budget crisis. But I think, so much of a mayor's tenure depends on like unforeseen circumstances, a natural disaster, a Hurricane Sandy or something. And so it's really hard to prognosticate too far in advance. But I think we're coming up at 100 days, and I think, I think the hardest thing that he's navigated so far is the deaths from during the cold storm. And so he's had some rough moments, but he's also had some progress.
I would just very quickly say, Hochul is doing very well in the polls in her reelection against Bruce Blakeman, the Nassau County Chief Executive. She needs to win big. The Democrats need to take back the House, which involves taking some seats in New York. And Mamdani needs to be seen as not having hurt their chances and not being, sort of an anvil around the neck of Democrats running in purple districts. If they're in a position where they felt like he helped or at least didn't hurt, she has won big. We'll probably be revisiting a discussion about raising taxes to fund the out years of childcare expansion. I think if in a year we're in that position, it will be a good relationship.
Great. Ben, Emma, we'll have you back to check in on these issues. And
my raise.
And your raise. Maybe we'll do a 40 New York profile on you. I nominate you. And maybe you can find a family that makes $1 million that will
That's
talk
the
to
goal.
you about it. So anyway, thank you guys.
Thank you.
That's it for this edition of Close Up. If you'd like to support more programs like this, please consider donating at the link on your screen. For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Jeff Mays, sitting in for Sam Roberts. Thank you for watching.